This is Pet Life Radio. Let's talk pets.
This episode of Vet Candy is brought to you by Kruuse Manuka Honey, your first choice for moist wound healing.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Vet Candy's podcast in other news. This is a podcast that's going to expand your idea of what is impacting the veterinary world, veterinarians, and all animal care professionals as humans. We are your co-hosts. I'm Dr. Jen.
And I'm Dr. Jason Chatfield.
If you are not yet a Vet Candy subscriber,
why not?
Please subscribe for free today at myvetcandy.com. And as always, any listener can reach me with messages of love and positivity at jen@myvetcandy.com.
And also, as always, for those of you guys that like to speak the truth and get real with it, hit me up at jason@myvetcandy.com.
Okay, so today, maybe I got the wrong notes. My notes say that today we're discussing honey, but this is not.
That's the same notes I got.
What?
Yeah, listen. In other news, honey is good for more than just peanut butter sandwiches, and we're going to find out how.
What? How are we going to find that out? You got like a mouse in your pocket? Who's the we that's going to find this out?
I was hoping you were going to tell me because I really like honey on some peanut butter. I'll tell you that much.
I know. There's so many jokes to be made about honey. However, I think there's like a legit professional discussion to be had. So we should bring in a legit professional to have that discussion with us, right? So yes, welcoming back into the Candyverse, Dr. Courtney Campbell.
Oh my goodness, that was an incredible intro, man. That made me so happy. Listen, thank you guys for this opportunity. It's always fun to come back to the familiar neighborhood. And when I come back here on this podcast, it definitely feels like family. So thanks again. And you're right. This is something I've been really looking forward to because we're going to get a chance to talk about honey. We've seen a lot of interest and a lot of headlines about the use of medical grade honey in various applications like wounds and things like that.
Hold up. Medical grade honey.
In the headlines, Jason. Did you hear that in the headlines?
Well, some headlines, but I've never heard of medical grade honey. What is that? I can't get that at the supermarket?
I love it because there's a lot to unpack there. Number one, honey. Are we really using honey for medicine? And then within the umbrella term of honey or just the substance of honey, there's a subset of honeys that can have medical benefits.
There's a subset of honeys?
Just the term medical grade honey by itself, like you said, it blows a lot of people's minds.
It does. So what's your favorite subset of honeys, Dr. Campbell?
You know what? I'm going to say 100% Manuka medical grade honey, flat out. You know what I mean? And a lot of people say, wow, that's pretty declarative. You know what I mean? It is very specific, very declarative. But on this podcast, you don't allow me to pull my shot. So I got to just go out there and just say it 100%.
Aren't you going to ask me my favorite kind of honey?
What's your favorite kind of honey?
Clover.
It comes in the little bear.
Little bear, 100%.
So have you ever seen honey used, Jason, in a clinical setting? Not in the break room?
I have not. Listen, in all honesty, we've talked about it a few times or whatever, but I've never actually seen it in action.
I saw it used one time. It was only a couple of years ago because it was when I was in vet school. I was walking through the large animal hospital at the UNAM in Mexico City, and they were treating a horse wound on the distal back leg, I think if I remember right, with honey. And I thought to myself, is that a thing?
You thought to yourself, they got to be out of Silvadine. That's what you thought.
You know that's what I thought. Especially on horses, right?
Oh, this is temporary. Yeah, it's funny.
This is like a stopgap measure till the Silvadine arrives. So my question is this new, Dr. Campbell?
You know, it really isn't. You know, I was thinking about this a lot because I was thinking about the opportunity to speak with both of you. And I was like, this is literally the opposite of new. I mean, we have seen the ancient Egyptians using honey even as early as like 2500 BC. They found containers of honey 2500 years BC that were uncontaminated. So we know that honey has like these tremendous antibacterial properties. If you look at some of the earliest surgical treatises like papyrus, where it's written on papyrus, these old military like surgical journals, you'll see really well written there are descriptions of applying honey to wounds. So from ancient Egypt to old medical journal papyrus, like surgical treaties, to just other historical references of using honey for medical purposes, it's incredible because it's making a resurgence. It's like what is old is now new again. It's like going back to the future.
That's an excellent story and an excellent reference. I love it. I think you may have watched a special movie last night. I don't really know, but
I would like the DeLorean instead.
You don't want honey?
No, you guys can have the honey and I'll take the hoverboard and the DeLorean.
All right. So, Dr. Campbell, listen. So, how do they use the honey? Do they just open a little snout, a little tip, and just squeeze it on there and slather it on there? Or how does it, is there any kind of special way to use honey? How does that work?
And I got one question before you get to that, because I want to back up before you slather it on the wound. Like, because honey can have stuff in it that's no good, right? Like you can't give it to babies, right? Because it's got botulism in it potentially. How is this safe to be slathering on the wound?
Right. And I think that both questions could be blended into one. First, how do you use it and why this honey? And the reality is, a lot of people ask me, why medical grade? Why Manuka? And the answer is very simple, is because, naturally occurring honey, like you mentioned, could have the bacteria in it that they find in honey at times. And that includes Clostridium botulinum, like you said, botulism toxin. And there are a lot of people who know a lot about Botox. You know what I mean?
Dr. Campbell, is that a shot at the female that's on the podcast?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It was more a California reference. But I will say this. The truth is this. When it comes to medical grade honey, you do want medical grade simply means that they've been able to sterilize it through gamma radiation, which will kill naturally occurring organisms like Clostridium botulinum. Also, you want to make sure that it meets certain standards, right? And so you're looking for something that is 100% Manuka honey. There are various formulations of it that have 80%, 90%. Ideally, if you can get 100%, that would be ideal, particularly because of a substance in medical grade honey or Manuka honey called methylgloxal. Now, it used to be called the Manuka factor. That was the term for it.
I prefer that one.
I'm wondering what Manuka is. Like, I was thinking that was like some kind of a company name or something, but Manuka is like referring to some compound within the honey, or is that what you're getting at? Or
yeah, it's actually referring to the plant. There's a Manuka shrub that bees feed on, and it's found in Australia, New Zealand. And when bees feed on this particular honey has increased antibacterial properties compared to other types of honey. So now that you know, number one, what's the big deal about medical grade? Number one, we know it's free of herbicides, pesticides, and we know that it's taken in a sustainable way. That's number one, free of heavy metals. Second, we know that it's sterilized by gamma radiation to kill Clostridium botulinum. And then third, we know that it needs to meet a certain standard of this Manuka factor, and we'll use that term instead of methylgloxal. We know that it has to meet those. So those are the main three ways that when people ask you, why Manuka, why medical grade, you can say to them, hey, standards, bacteria, and obviously sterilization. So that's the key there.
Where does one get this? I'm back to the grocery store because I know very little, but I know about honey. There's a bunch of different kinds of honey. Am I able to buy this honey at the grocery store?
dude, Australia and New Zealand. He said Australia and New Zealand.
I'm not going there to get Manuka honey with the methyl glycolate.
That's the first thing people do. And they say, hey, I heard honey is good for wounds and has medical applications. I'm just going to go to the nearest grocery store. I'm just going to grab it off the shelf. Big challenges there. Number one, is it free of herbicides, pesticides, heavy metals? Number two, is it sterilized by gamma radiation? Answer is no. Number three, are we sure that it doesn't have Clostridium botulinum? And then, of course, is it 100% Manuka honey? You know what I mean? So at the end of the day, I think that when you walk by the shelf and you say, oh my goodness, look at that shelf there. There's Manuka honey. And that's exactly what they were talking about on the podcast. You say to yourself, no, it has to be medical grade.
Well, but I mean, any port in a storm, right? Like if I was stuck out camping or something, maybe. I have another question. At the time, remember when I was walking through the large animal clinic and I asked in my probably like toddler level Spanish, what's happening right here? Why are you putting this honey on there? So they explained to me, I think it's probably a little bit more sophisticated than this, Dr. Campbell, but it provides some kind of nourishment for the cells that are attempting to close the wound, but it doesn't provide the same thing for bacteria that are trying to grow there. Is that what happens? I mean,
no, I think you're spot on. I would say if somebody asked me flat out, what are the 3 reasons to celebrate the use of medical grade honey? What are the 3 or 4 reasons to celebrate? I would say let's start celebrating number one, right? Raise the roof. Let's bring that in from the 90s, right? I would say simply number one, basically bacterial resistance or antimicrobial properties. And there's two ways mainly. It both kills bacteria, right? It uses enzymes to dissolve them and they die in this fiery death of enzymes. And then also it provides a barrier because of its viscosity, right? It's provided in a variety of substances, both in a syrup, mostly paste-like form, and it is also impregnated in gauze and things like that. So just as a barrier, it prevents bacteria from contaminating the wound. So I'd say from an antimicrobial standpoint, both it kills bacteria and prevents them from getting into the wound. The second reason I would celebrate medical grade Manuka honey is like exactly what you said. It nourishes the wound. It provides a moist wound environment. You're right. Those cells that are marching, those skin cells that are marching across the granulation tissue all the way to the other side so that they can form that bridge. This honey is nourishing.
And those are your favorite cells, if I recall, right?
I like myofibroblasts because they're involved in wound contraction. You have like the best memory like an elephant. I would say number 3, ease of application. Right?
Ease of application, only if I can get it at the local Winn-Dixie. But on the point of reference to the co-host and likening her to an elephant, I think we're going to take a short break. So hang here because we're going to get to the third reason why Manuka honey is killing it in wound care. So we'll check you guys on the other side.
Hey, Doc, your next patient is here.
Great, bring him over.
Doc, this one is a doozy. A really nasty wound.
Let me take a look. Yes, that is pretty bad.
Let me go grab some antibiotic cream. Be right back.
No. No antibiotic cream for this guy. My first choice for moist wound healing is Kruuse Manuka honey.
Honey? Did you say honey?
Yes, honey. Manuka honey. Honey has antibacterial properties. It also maintains a moist wound condition and provides a protective barrier to prevent infection. Plus, it's all natural.
Okay. Let me grab some Kruuse Manuka honey and let's get this pup fixed up.
You got it. Learn more about the healing powers of Kruuse Manuka honey at kruuse.com.
Oh, sure. It's all fun and games until someone ends up in a cone. That's right. We're animals. Deal with it. Pet Life Radio. Let's talk pets.
Let's talk pets.
Let's talk pets
On Pet Life Radio.
Pet Life Radio.
PetLifeRadio.com.
We're back, and the constantly interrupted Dr. Campbell, who is so tolerant and when he enters the Candyverse, was relaying the top reasons why Manuka honey is killing it if you are looking to select honey. So my question, I think you were getting to it with the reasons why one might select honey versus some other wound dressing, right? Some other type of wound care, right? The viscosity, antimicrobial properties within the honey itself. And then the third one, which is where I interrupted you.
No, absolutely. You hit the nail right on the head. First, antimicrobial properties, then like what you had referenced as far as nourishing the wound. I like number 3, and there's plenty. Listen, this list could be 10 items long, but we're just only here for 4. I would say number 3 for me is ease of application because there are so many other wound dressings. Listen, we'll get to wet to dries at another time, but certainly people do those sorts of things. You talked about silver. There was a reference to silver sulfadiazine earlier in the podcast. And so I just love the fact that honey comes in a variety of sources, including the paste, the calcium alginates, the hydrocolloids. When you're talking about moisture retentive dressings, the goal here is to keep the wound moist. So if you can keep the wound moist and provide that in a honey environment, that works out great. And number 4, I would say it's cost effective because some of these wound dressings, everything from vacuum-assisted wound therapy to a variety of other topical treatments, they can actually get pretty expensive. And so if you can have something that is relatively cost effective, it is easy to apply, it kills bacteria, and it nourishes the wound, I would say it is hard to find a wound dressing that hits all those nails on the head.
And it's safe if the pet licks it.
You know what? It is safe. You want to obviously be careful because, when you're talking about ingestion, size definitely matters, right? I tell you, the size matters. So some of these dogs and cats can be quite small.
So speaking of ingestion and danger and licking it, do you just put this stuff on there and leave it, or do you put a dressing over it? I had the opportunity to see. Of course, it's sticky, right? Is it not sticky?
It certainly is. And I so appreciate that question because what it basically underscores is the importance of a 3-layer dressing. The honey should be always incorporated in a primary layer where you have a medical treatment and also helps to keep the wound moist. Then you have your secondary and your tertiary layer to basically protect the bandage, and it basically prevents the wound from becoming dehydrated or losing moisture. So you are 100% correct. That honey should always be incorporated in the primary layer, and then on top of that, a secondary layer, and then tertiary layer. And then here's the key for me. For both of you, what has been your experience with wounds? Because they happen all the time, regardless of the species you're working on. Dr. Jason, Dr. Jen, what has been your experience with wounds? Every clinician has their own wound story, and I see a lot of pad injuries, surgical site injuries. What do you guys, what's been your experience?
I mean, does anything that you take care of, Jason, ever get sick or die?
No, but back a long time ago in my life, I had to take care of these animals that were on pasture and not tame and forever away. It was the Cowboys, right? We used dirt, which is terrible, but that's what we had, right? But honey sounds like it might have been excellent. We had a lot of those kind of wounds that we couldn't get to every day or every week with all kinds of dangerous drugs and stress. Mm-hmm. I could have slapped some honey on there and said, you're good for, oh, wait. How long does the honey last? That's my question. How long should I leave this stuff on, right? Weeks, days?
I will say that is a great alternative depending upon how exudative the wound would be. Like you said, just slap some honey on it and that would help granulation tissue formation. But you're right. If it is a severely contaminated wound or there's areas of necrosis in the wound, or if the wound is severely exudative, you are correct that wound treatment, that honey wound treatment or bandage application should be changed every 1 to 2 days. There are reports that honey could even stay there as long as 5 days, but it depends again if you're dealing with the wet or dry wound.
So I have a question about that too. So some of the worst wounds I ever took care of were reptiles. Reptiles don't do anything fast. Like there's no reptile emergencies. You got 2 weeks before it decides if it's going to live or die, right? So you got time to figure it out. But we would see wounds, whether it was reptile versus reptile or it was reptile versus heat. And if I couldn't provide a primary closure, then my biggest concern was fungal infection. And second to that was pack a lunch because they're going to take forever to heal. And so for freaking ever to granulate it. So when you're using honey, does it disappear from the wound? Because, a lot of dressings, if you put them on and you cover them, put like a nonstick or a gauze, if you're just doing a stay wet type thing, and then I take it off 3 days later, a lot of those dressings will they'll just be gone, right? I'll just be taking it off and there's the wound. So does honey disappear? Does it get absorbed? Does it sit there? What happens?
No, you hit on a lot of really important points. First and foremost, when we talked about Manuka honey, we celebrated, one of our first bullet points was that we're going to celebrate the antimicrobial activities. But what I forgot to mention is that it also fights fungi, it fights viruses, it fights protozoa. If you're worried about fungal contamination, boom, honey. If you're worried about viruses, boom, honey. If you're worried about protozoa, boom, honey. I think if you're looking at a wound, you say, man, what should we use? And somebody says, boom, honey.
That's what I say now. I don't say anything. I just say, boom, honey.
There you go. You've got it. So you brought in another point that I think is awesome on the human side. I'm sorry, they're not humans, people. For people, they're certainly using, I guess that's what we got to call them, right? People. So they're using certainly the honey for diabetic ulcers, radiation burns, thermal burns. So when you're talking about poorly healing wounds or wounds that are going to take a while, that's something that, obviously I have experience, and it's a problem, like you said. And then finally, to answer your question, I was a little bit long-winded to answer your question. Yes, it does disappear. The sugar dissolves, and then you're left with hydrogen peroxide, and that hydrogen peroxide is killing bacteria, but then that gets inactivated in a moist wound. And the final thing you're left with is the word that nobody wants to say, which is methylgloxal.
Okay, so you said hydrogen peroxide. So here's my question then, because I don't use hydrogen peroxide in wounds, and I will tell you not to ever put hydrogen peroxide in a wound unless, like your plane crashed, you're in the middle of the desert, the only thing you have is hydrogen peroxide, and you know that there's like dead tissue in there. You're trying to get that crustiness off because you had to walk 3 miles before you got to the hydrogen peroxide. Anyway, because it can potentially damage healthy tissue, do I have to be concerned about that? If the sugar dissolves and I'm left with hydrogen peroxide, and then I'm left with the methylglyoxal, if I, move through the process there, well, how much hydrogen peroxide is that? Is it enough that I'm going to have to worry about tissue damage or inflammation or what?
Absolutely not. A great point. Number one, people out there are still probably saying, hey, let's just pour a little hydrogen peroxide on it. And then somebody, a clinician might say, hey, don't do that. And you say, why? I didn't know hydrogen peroxide is bad. And you nailed it 100% in my opinion.
It's got an incredible marketing campaign, right? Like it foams up. It's beautiful.
I would say, number one, it is non-selective. You're right. So it kills both good and bad stuff. And the good stuff we want to keep. And honey is selective. So the hydrogen peroxide that is left after the sugar dissolves is not going to harm. It's at a low enough concentration that it's not going to harm good tissue. And then once that hydrogen peroxide is inactivated in a moist wound through an enzyme called catalase, which we don't have to talk about, the bottom line is now you're left with non-peroxide based killing. Non-peroxide based killing, which is that whole methylglyoxal. So that's the point of medical grade honey. That's the point of Manuka honey. That's the point of applying honey, is that you can kill bacteria through a non-peroxide based system. And that's what I love about it.
Boom, honey.
It's like another shirt. This is fantastic.
I mean, clearly Mariah mistitled her recently released autobiography. It should have been Boom, Honey.
Listen, at the end of the day, when you say to yourself, well, I've got things that I'm comfortable with, and I've got old tips and tricks of wound care that I'm comfortable with. I'm not into switching, whether it's silver sulfadiazine or wet to dry bandage or any of these other techniques. You don't have to think about the new and next fancy wound of application and treatment. You can go back to an old, ancient favorite. And in my opinion, that would be, medical grade Manuka honey. You don't have to necessarily say, well, they've got these new fancy products out there. Yes, the cool thing is about these honey products is that they can be incorporated in various wound dressings, whether it's like you were saying, hydrocolloid, hydrogels, calcium alginate. But the neat thing is that it's something that's been around since ancient Egypt.
I have 2 questions. Number one, does the honey travel around in an invisible jet? Because it's sort of sounding like a superhero.
It's superhuman, yeah, and it's amazing. Let's be real about this. We're talking a lot about how amazing honey is. And I think the point you're making is well taken. The medical grade honey itself has amazing properties, but it still has to be applied in a smart and evidence-based way and according to wound principles, right? So first and foremost, you got to lavage the wound. Step 1, lavage the wound. It rehydrates tissue, gets rid of foreign debris, gets rid of surface bacteria. And then step 2, debride the wound, whether that's either a superficial debridement or surgical debridement. You got to get rid of all that tissue. But when you're lavaging that wound, you know what I mean? You're making the tissues hydrated so that white blood cells are literally the most precise surgeons out there because they go through and they just take away all that bad bacteria, but they do it on a microscopic level. And so by keeping a wound moist, like with a moisture retentive dressing, like with honey, you are allowing those white blood cells to do their job.
So if you have an exudative wound, like if I have one that's just pumping out pus and nasty fiber and it looks gross, and I clean that off, but I know like tomorrow when I change the bandage, it's going to be full of crap again. That's appropriate to put honey on, right? Because I should slowly see a decrease in the exudate from the wound.
Yeah, sometimes bandages need to be changed every 12 hours or every 24 hours until the amount of discharge from the wound decreases. And then you could start to extend the interval between those bandage changes. But you're 100% correct. You still have to, despite all the amazing properties of honey, it still has to be applied according to wound management principles. So thank you for bringing up that point.
Okay. And then I remembered my other question. Now the train of thought came back through the station. Is it possible for those like hallucinogenic compounds that can be incorporated into the honey if the bees feed on the philodendrons or that family of plants be incorporated in the Manuka honey? Or is it just a Dalmatian that I'm treating?
Now, I will definitely say, as far as hallucinogenic properties of medical grade Manuka honey, you are in a class of your own, Dr. Jen. I'm not totally sure about that, but that's certainly something we can look into. Out of all the questions about wound management and medical grade Manuka honey, as far as hallucinogenic properties of honey, I'd never have gotten that. Thank you for bringing that up. That'll be for the next, if we do a round 2.
Yeah, only Dr. Jen can figure out how to turn something so awesome like honey into some hallucinogenic situation.
I mean, it happens. If the bees feed off of certain flowers, then the honey that they produce is laced with hallucinogenic compounds, and you have a situation. And I'm just asking, like, is it because I put the honey on a Weimaraner that behavior occurred, or is it because the honey was contaminated with?
I would say, listen, at the end of the day, you are right. There are current studies, and I saw one in 2019 and one in 2020. They are now starting to investigate other types of honey for its properties. But by and large, what we know for sure is that if a bee feeds on a Manuka shrub, right, New Zealand or Australia, you can apply it safely without worrying about whether your pet is going to hallucinate.
You got to hit it with the gamma radiation. You either have Hulk or you have very good honey.
I love the Avengers reference, Dr. Jason. I love it. That's incredible. I mean, I'm not sure why we have to keep slamming my favorite wound dressings, but I think I'm going to have to maybe consider adding honey to the list.
I would say what's cool about honey too is you can incorporate other antibacterial, antimicrobial ointments or dressings along with honey. You can, if you want to use honey by itself, that's awesome.
But you can mix it in with other stuff?
It depends on what you've cultured from the wound. And that's a level of complicated wound healing that I think I would sort of handle according to what the wound shows me. But you absolutely could use petroleum-based or other wound dressings along with honey in the situation you need to. For example, if you culturing something like Staphylococcus pseudointermedius, which is highly resistant, or even in the case of MRSA, what we found is that just recently they looked at medical grade Manuka honey. These Staph pseudointermedius strains were susceptible. All of them would die with medical grade Manuka honey. So they basically tested alone. They tested this Manuka honey against these severely aggressive and resistant bugs from Staph pseudointermedius. And they found that medical grade honey could literally take them all out. And then here's the kicker. If it couldn't get rid of these bacteria, if it couldn't slaughter these bacteria, it actually assisted the antibiotic to do that. So in the situation where an antibiotic was having trouble killing this bacteria, if you added honey, you got a boost, a synergistic, almost like you were saying, a superhero boost from the honey to kill this bacteria.
We call that a superhero mashup.
I love it. So even if honey can't get it done, honey joins the team.
Honey joins the team.
You guys know what the ancient Egyptians are saying right now?
What?
Well, duh.
Well, duh.
Took you lots of evolution and all kinds of education to get to this point. We've been there forever.
But I do have one more question, because our listeners in the Candyverse who are taking care of wounds, just changing a bandage is no longer just changing a bandage. It's a whole situation. So are there any disinfecting solutions we should stay away from? Do we have to, so I like to use a Chlorhex solution, right? Because the betadine stains my nails. And so if I'm using Chlorhex solution to clean that exudative gunk off of the top of a wound before I put that dressing on, do I have to rinse all of that off? Do I have to be careful not to get that with the honey? Is there any situation, or doesn't matter? Just do my usual stuff and put honey on instead?
It's all about concentration. And you mentioned something called, that I really like, a biguanide called chlorhexidine gluconate. I like chlorhexidine, but it can't be used in too heavy of a concentration. So the ideal concentration for everybody that's listening and treating wounds is 0.05% dilute chlorhexidine. And the cool thing about that is that they found at those concentrations, it's able to kill surface bacteria without harming those cells. And so I think you're spot on. You absolutely can use chlorhexidine to rinse wounds. There's also studies looking at tap water. You could absolutely use tap water because it's hypertonicity. That will take away a lot of dirt and debris. But I would always flush tap water with sterile saline afterwards. So that is an excellent point. And finally, a lot of people are trying to lavage wounds using bulb syringes and squirting syringes. You have to get that PSI up to that pressure per square inch. You have to get that up to 7 to 8, right? And the best way to do that is
break a needle off
and then put it up to, like you said, 300 millimeters of mercury. If the pressure is too high, you can cause damage. If it's too low, it ain't going to do anything. So I think at the end of the day, like you said, 100%, let's get a nice chlorhexidine rinse on there, make sure it's the right concentration. get your PSI up in terms of wound lavage so that it's doing something. And then finally go ahead and take out all that necrotic stuff and place your honey dressing.
Place your honey dressing. You heard it here first.
Place your honey. Boom. Place your honey. Do you forego systemic antibiotics in many of these cases? Like, are you that bold? Are you that confident? Are you that close with honey?
It sounds a little bit like I'm hedging my answer here, but the reality is it is based a lot on culture. You brought up reptiles, which I thought was spot on, because we are sometimes dealing, even in mammals, with cases of wounds that they don't bleed when you cut them.
Especially if you have an ice pack between the wound and the heart.
Right, exactly. So if you have a situation where the dog or any mammal's hypothermic or hypovolemic, then those wounds won't bleed when you cut them. So I wouldn't necessarily use that as an indicator that a wound is not viable. Oh, it doesn't bleed when I cut it. Well, are they hypothermic? Are they hypovolemic? And so, certainly if I have a wound and I culture a nasty bug, I will absolutely prescribe systemic antibiotics in those situations.
Well, just for folks who are listening, because it's flying around in that invisible jet, the Manuka honey, and it does have a lot of great properties. If you're looking to use a wound dressing that does not contribute to the ever-growing problem of antimicrobial resistance, medical grade Manuka honey is a good choice, right? But then the question is, do I have to give the systemic antibiotics? And I guess it depends.
It definitely depends. Do you feel confident enough with your fresh wound bed that is granulating well, and if the dog's otherwise doing well? However, if you are concerned about the status of the wound, as they say, when in doubt, cut it out, right? Depending upon the wound itself.
I don't know if everybody says that.
Well, I say when in doubt, if it's skin, leave it in, because what you can do is come back later and see, if it's necrosing or whatever. But I think at the end of the day, if you are confident that you have a nice, healthy wound bed, systemically the dog's doing fine, you can make that decision to forego systemic antibiotics. But in general, I will say, if I'm culturing a bacteria from a wound and I am concerned about this wound healing, I absolutely will prescribe antibiotics consistent with that. And particularly the wound has to be viable, right? So how are antibiotics going to get there if the wound is not viable? So that's why it's so important to create a healthy wound environment that's viable so that the antibiotics you're prescribing can actually get to the point.
Jason, do you know what I heard from all of that? If the wound doesn't bleed, it means we have a problem. Like, add that to our steps in assessing viability, right? Poke it with a stick and see if the wound bleeds. A dry wound is not going to heal fast, friends, and it's going to leave a big old scar.
Right. I'd say everybody who's listening, for me, it's about ACT, right? And if you're saying, I don't even understand how to assess wound viability, I would say, think about attachment, you know what I mean? The color and the texture. So if the wound's peeling, right? If the skin's peeling back, it's not attaching. That's a problem. Color. I'm going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, on your own podcast, if you would give people and award them a Vet Candy t-shirt. They can guess some colors of wounds. I'm going to give you a couple that are bad. You see skin, you go, oh my goodness, these are not good. There's 5 of them, I would say, and I'll give you 3. Okay.
There's 5 different colors of wounds?
5 different colors of wounds that are bad. If you see this, you're like, holy cow, we have a problem. We have a major problem. I would say in general, there are about 5 colors. There could be others, but if I'll give you 3 of the 5, you just got to guess the other 2.
Aren't there only Roy G. Biv? There's only 7 colors anyway, right?
There's certainly 5 bad ones. If I see a wound with any of these 5 bad colors, then I say, okay, there's a major issue here.
Are you wanting people to email in and tell us the colors, and we'll send them a Vet Candy t-shirt if they hit on one of your colors?
I would love to be, you guys are the most amazing hosts on the planet. I'm just a visitor, but I would say this, if that's something you want to do, I think everybody would really love it.
Bad colors of wounds, give us 3.
Black, brown, gray.
Those are all bad. 2 more that are bad.
If you see skin that is pitch black, if the skin looks brown, obviously if there's not underlying pigments of the skin that are already brown. And then of course, if you see skin that's gray, these are problematic. And again, probably fit in the area of when in doubt, cut it out. Particularly if if there's an excessive skin and you're not going to be worried about wound closure in the future. Now, there are 2 more that are probably a little bit more difficult. Yeah. And so it's all about that ACT. And I don't mean that standardized test. I mean attachment, color, and texture. Last thing we didn't talk about is texture. slimy. If the wound's slimy, if the skin is like mozzarella, string cheese.
So jerky is bad.
Yeah, but not good. And so if you're seeing texture that's slimy, jerky, stringy, this is all indications of, when in doubt, cut it out.
Jason, do you see how the surgeon continues to arrive at the solution being cut it out?
Cut it out, then put honey on it, right?
Whenever I'm talking to a surgeon and I say, here's like my bottom line question, right? You want me to do something crazy that I think is like super nuts. And I look at you and I say, is this going to make my scar smaller? And if you say yes, bring it. I will go to crazy town. I'm happy for that, right? Like, yeah. And so a lot of clients are concerned with that. So I think that's all good stuff.
We are so fortunate that our mammalian and reptilian friends, man, and everybody else, they do not care about scars. You know what I mean? They're just not as self-conscious as we are. I love that.
Well, I don't know. Charlene's pretty self-conscious. She is. And I bet old Quarantina wouldn't appreciate you talking about big old scars.
She's, you know what I mean? She's got other things on her mind, like how much she can hoard food, you know what I mean? In her cheek pouches. How many times she can make the wheel spin. She's got other things she's concentrating on. But certainly, like you said, scars may not be one of those things.
Yeah. All right, Jason, do you have any other questions about Boom, honey?
Again, how could I possibly have any other questions? We really ran the gamut on this one from A to Z, all about honey, and threw in some leeches. This is fantastic.
I mean, we didn't bring up maggots.
I think Dr. Campbell actually mentioned the maggots.
That could be another episode, but when you're talking about surgical debridement, listen, maggots are on another level too. So
you know what else is? Those little fishes.
When you're getting a pedicure, I've never got
the pedicure fish. That's right.
Come on, listeners, you know what I'm talking about. Newshounds, you guys know what I'm talking about. Like for like $20, the little fishes nibble the dry skin and the callus off your feet. I mean, it's a circle of life, people. Okay, well, I have to tell you, I have a whole new respect and a reason to celebrate honey.
What is the reason to celebrate honey? We hit so many points. I just wanted to say thank you for letting us hit those points about honey, and because it's one of my favorite things to talk about.
Jason, was there any doubt in your mind after our discussion that this is one of Dr. Campbell's favorite topics?
Zero doubt. I thought I liked honey. Not even in the same atmosphere as Courtney. None. Zero. Comparatively, I think I don't like honey as much as he likes it. It's crazy.
We tease you, we jest, but we love it when you come into the Candyverse and nerd out with us a little bit. I mean, methylgloxal, come on. Really, really like it. And I know that the tips that you've provided for wound care, just even wound assessment and making that plan will be significant for folks moving forward. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Campbell.
Thanks for having me.
And if you in the Candyverse want to email us at jen@myvetcandy.com
or jason@myvetcandy.com. Sorry, I was logging into my burner account there.
He's logging in. He's trying to win a t-shirt, folks. If you provide us with one of the 2 remaining wound colors that are bad, we will pick a winner. And actually, if you kind of want to be more descriptive than just saying one single color, you could throw a little extra adjectives in there for us. We like it. We like it. So anything that fulfills that ACT. So we would love to get it, and we'll send you a t-shirt, and we'll even say your name on the subsequent episode of the podcast. And as always, thank you so much for joining us in the Candyverse. I'm Dr. Jen.
And I'm Dr. Jason.
And we'll catch you guys on the next episode of In Other News.
Let's Talk Pets, every week on demand, only on PetLifeRadio.com.